There was a time in the 1630s, even the early 40s, when Amsterdam loved everything I did. The richest and most fashionable burgomasters wanted portraits from me. I made paintings for the head of state. I had more pupils than any other painter. That was 20 years ago. Now, my pupils are more popular than me, and I'm fodder for the gossips. He's got a bastard child. He never pays his bills. He can't paint like he used to. But they're right about that. These days I paint better. And there were always some people who knew that I was catching something closer to what being a human is. Ugly. Damaged. Old. What ends up on the canvas? What ends up in your eyes? That's all that matters to me.
We're standing here in front of an anatomy lesson, at least a part of an anatomy lesson. It was severely damaged by fire in the 18th century, but there's still this moving fragment of the middle section that survived. And it shows us the dead body with a brain dissection going on. And Rembrandt is emphasizing the dead state of this corpse. You almost can feel the weight of this corpse. So it's very realistic rendering of the scene. There's no escape. We have urge to look on what's happening here and to enjoy these wonderful broad brushstrokes. This is looking like almost impressionist painting, and it's Rembrandt at his very best.
His name was Joris Fontaine. People on the street called him Blackjack, a petty thief. And then he pulled a knife while robbing a draper's shop. So they hung him and gave the body to the Surgeons' Guild. It's my second painting of an anatomy lesson, of course. 24 years since I made the anatomy lesson of Dr. Nicolaus Tulp. I've been married, widowed. I have a son by my dead wife, a daughter by the woman that I live in sin with, my Henrikia. I'm a different man now. I'm a different painter.
You can see what happens between these two portraits. I mean, there's such an evolution between 1632 and 1656. Where, first of all, just on a basic level, the kind of brushwork that Rembrandt is using has just loosened so much, and the kind of way that he conveys meaning is just opened up in all kinds of ways.
It has been said in art history that apparently the Surgeons' Guild was so satisfied with the result of the Dr. Tulp painting that 24 years later they approached Rembrandt yet again, so he was still popular. I think it could have been slightly different. If you look at the fashionable portrait painters of those years, like Rembrandt pupils, they had better things to do in the mid-50s, making great paintings for the town hall or portraying the elite of Amsterdam. They might have wanted to avoid the circumstances in which you had to make your sketches for a painting like this in a rather smelly anatomy hall. Rembrandt, on the contrary, he could really use the money.
I have a certain sympathy with this ruin of a man. My pupils get the best work, while I watch surgeons take Blackjack to pieces, looking for his soul inside the brain, his organ of thought, all thoughtless now. What do I know? I'm just a painter, desperate for the 1,000 guilders that I'll get when this is finished. But I can tell you where the soul of this city lies, in money bags and banks and counting houses.
I love all phases of his face to draw because it's a good storytelling phase, as he shows in his self-portraits also. And I think he is. I always have the feeling he's not a man of many words. So if you want to show something about his emotions, you have to do that through his expression. And it all falls apart around his 50s. It all starts sagging down, as we all must endure at a certain point. And of course, there's always this big bulbous nose that sort of holds it up. The eyes begin to sag. Big, sort of fat lips. I hate to say it, Rembrandt. And he wasn't so famous anymore. And he wasn't that popular anymore. The taste of the public had moved on, of the audience, and he was really not doing very well financially.
The debts were mounting when I painted my boy, Titus. He was about 14, better looking than I ever was, with a hat, just like his dad's. Him. But I even owe him money, according to the will his mother wrote before she died. Half of our estate, if I ever remarry. Money that I haven't had for years. So no marriage for me and Henrikia. Love is all we can afford. It's this house that sunk me. That's why I had to borrow 9,000 guilders to pay it off. I tried to sell it last year and buy a cheaper place. Of course, deals all fell through. I've come to hate money, but only slaves can live without it. Once, I was the most successful painter in the city. Now I need some way to stay out of debtor's prison.
Well, we're looking at this wonderful painting by Johannes Lingelbach, painter from Frankfurt, who ended up in the Netherlands after a long stay in Italy. And it's a wonderful coincidence that this painting is dated in the lower left corner, 1656, the very year that Rembrandt not only painted his second anatomy lesson, but probably shortly afterwards, he was going to this town hall, going to the first floor, to the right, to the chamber of insolvency, and declaring his insolvency. In this year, the painting was done, 1656.
And that's it. I'm a self-declared bankrupt in the hands of the city. It's shameful, but safer. Now no one can knock on my door and demand full payment. I'm protected by the courts.
I've been a law professor for over 25 years, business experience in law for over 40 years. So after a rather active professional life, I started at the end of 2017 to study more systematically and thoroughly with bankruptcy. And why? Because it's better than playing golf or go to the garden. Because I like it. There are all types of stories around it. I think the majority in the Netherlands thinks that Rembrandt had what we call holds in his hands, meaning that you spend too much. If your salary is 1,000 and you spend 2,000, and you do that over a longer period, it's not going well with you, especially in the Netherlands, where still the attitude is you have to pay your bills.
few days after Rembrandt got involved with the Desolate Boedelskamer, the city organization that was dealing with bankruptcies, they wanted to know, of course, what did he possess, this Rembrandt. And they went to his house and they made a whole list, an inventory of what they found in his house. And they went from one room to another.
It would have been the morning of the 25th of July, 1656. That would have been the first of 2 days devoted to taking the inventory with a notary assigned by the Desolate Boedelskamer. And Rembrandt would have accompanied the notary every step of the way, because we see all kinds of detailed descriptions that a notary would not have known about.
The inventory list is for us, and for me personally, working as a curator at the Rembrandt House Museum, it's an amazing treasure of understanding more of the person, Rembrandt, the man, the collector, the art lover, the artist, the way he lived in the house, the way the house was used. And most of all, it's important that this inventory list still exists.
They start with het voorhuis, which is the first part of the house when you enter, and then they make a list of the paintings first. And what kind of paintings do we see?
The first painting we encounter is a stukje van Adrian Brouwer, a small painting by Adrian Brouwer representing a pancake baker.
A painting from a woman with a little child from Rembrandt himself.
A painting we don't know about, a painter's studio by Adrian Brouwer, tantalizing, never been traced. And then, a small landscape by Hercules Segers. Like Brouwer, an enigmatic painter from the earlier generation, a great talent. Then we move on to the antechamber.
Here it continues, and there were a lot of paintings, again from Rembrandt himself, but also from others.
Here, there was a painting of the Samaritan, the Good Samaritan by Rembrandt. 2 greyhounds from life by the same. We're baffled. We don't know anything like that.
Faces from Brouwer, Parcellus.
This is interesting. Rembrandt has a lot of Parcellus too. These are all monochromatic seascapes.
None of the artists I loved were really fashionable. There are people I made friends with just because we both loved Parcellus, with his wild and stormy seas. Or Brouwer's mad, grinning faces, his roaring peasants. Or Hercules Segers and his imagined impossible, crazy landscapes. They're my discoveries. I love looking at these wonderful pictures, at the light escaping from another artist's mind.
Then they go to the art room, and there you find all kinds of materials, no paintings, but things from porcelain, also statues from the old Greeks, Socrates, Homerus, Aristoteles.
This room he calls his Kunstkammer, or the Chamber of Wonders and Art, the wonders of nature and the wonders of man.
Not only man makes things, God makes things too. Everything is extraordinary, and this is the room where I keep everything extraordinary I've found. Fragile corals from the tropic seas, exotic animals preserved and stuffed, flayed limbs cast in plaster, weapons from distant kingdoms. Things cast upon the shores of history. And my collection of prints and engravings, which I never could stop buying.
Listed separately in the inventory of the Kunstkammer are the art books, the Kunstboeken. This was even more important. This was vital to Rembrandt, and he may have felt more pain at having to potentially part with these.
A book of woodcuts by Lucas van Leyden, a book of copper engravings by the same artist, a book of drawings by the leading masters of the entire world. Goodbye, Prince by the elder Bruegel.
He must have had a sense of assurance that he could sell these things for something like what he paid for them, and that would have definitely floated him out of his financial troubles.
Was this enough to get out of it? That's the question.
If the inventory is complete, does it reflect the true goods in his estate? I doubt. Normally when people go into bankruptcy in present days, there's always some sniff of fraudulent action or hiding assets, which is rather common for the human being. And I think it's rather common for the human being 350, 360 years ago. And maybe Rembrandt has what we call black money, dirty money. You wouldn't know.
What, am I supposed to go like a lamb to the slaughter? I can promise you that our great burgomasters have back pockets, and nobody knows how full of money those are. Besides, I need to protect Titus, Enrique, and our little daughter, Cornelia. So yes, I planned for this.
If you look at the events prior to his bankruptcy, you can see that he's actually preparing for it. So, in 1655, and that's 1 year before, he applies for cessio bonorum, which is this certain kind of insolvency procedure. In 1655, Rembrandt has a voluntary sale of some of his goods.
Rembrandt rented rooms at an inn in order to have a grand sale of his possessions.
We do not know what was sold. We do not know what the income that arises from it. We don't know anything about this sale, and we don't know where the money went.
But we do know that he didn't pay the debt for renting these rooms, and that's why we have a record of it.
This is 1655, so it's right before his insolvency. And around this time, he loses the copperplates he made so far, which is 90% of all the prints that he ever made. I'm sure he had to sell them. And years later, all the major print publishers turn out to have copperplates by Rembrandt in their stock. Probably the ones that he had to sell around the mid-1650s.
Most of the copper plates are too worn down to print from. What I'm really selling is my fame as a printmaker. It's greater these days than my reputation as a painter. And then I turn to the millstone around my neck, the thing I should never have bought. It might be convenient not to own it anymore.
The date is 17th of May 1656. This is the moment that Rembrandt tries to manipulate the situation, that the house, which is of course all the time the most valuable thing around Rembrandt and in his life, that the house is not his, but his son's.
In transferring the deed to Titus, he gave over to his son his greatest financial asset. He also must have known that his creditors would have wanted to get a hold of that asset as well.
This is the fraud. I mean, this was not done, and he is doing it. This is the fraud.
He was making a conscious choice to protect himself and to protect his family rather than fulfill his obligations to his outside creditors. But honestly, when I think about it and I ask myself, what would I have done in a similar situation? I'm not sure that I would have made decisions that were different from what Rembrandt decided to do. That's the way I feel about it.
Ever since Titus's mother died, under the terms of her will, I've owed him half the estate. I'm simply doing my duty as a father. Now I'm prepared. The house is set aside. We have some money. I declare myself insolvent. The Chamber of Insolvent Estates takes my inventory, and the auctions begin. They squeeze my possessions. The money dribbles out. I have to wait while all the auctions happen. I have to hope that things sell for good prices. I feel as though I'm up for sale myself, and it all takes more than 2 years.
We see in this volume that Desolate Boedelkamer is trying to get a solution for Rembrandt's problems by selling his stuff. He comes back in this book, and there comes in some money, but it's by far not enough.
The auction returns are so low that one of the men I borrowed from, a wealthy burgomaster, insists that my house is sold. So it is. My last attempt to defend my boy's inheritance. Nothing goes right. I sent Titus to one of the auctions to buy back my own large mirror with the ebony frame, a useful item if you're famed for your self-portraits. He was successful and hired a workman to carry the mirror back.
So here we are, walking over the Rusland Bridge with the workman, the mirror on his head. Titus starts to warn people, excuse us, this is a precious piece we have here. And as the workman steps off the bridge, clearly a step down, there's a crack, and the mirror falls to pieces. This must have been a crushing moment for Titus and also later for Rembrandt. This was the gesture of a loyal son, a prized family possession, likely used for some of the famous self-portraits that we know, and it was destroyed.
Poor Titus came back with fragments, little pieces of busted luck. I had to use another mirror to paint myself again. I'm tired of the city courts and underbidders picking my pockets. Still, can't go on forever, and I'm as much myself as I ever was.
This is an astonishing piece of work. What we're seeing is someone literally 2 years after bankruptcy portraying himself in a manner that initially makes the viewer believe that you are dealing with a slightly irritated monarch. The artist's stick comes across as a scepter.
It's telling that during this time of turmoil, at the conclusion of his bankruptcy proceedings, that Rembrandt presents us with this image of himself still on top of his game, sitting in an armchair like a throne, wearing golden robes, his head high in the picture, looking down at us with a deep introspective expression. Rembrandt presents himself as the Prince of Painters, declaring to everyone who would see this self-portrait that he is still the most prominent painter in Amsterdam. He has wrinkles that he's not afraid to show. He has a somber expression, but yet still present and lively as the shadow passes across his face. We see the buildup of paint that is an expression of his powers at their height. No other artist could paint in such a fashion.
In this painting, Rembrandt shows that no matter what life has thrown at him, I am Rembrandt still.
Where I'm sitting is not a republic. I make the rules here. How the life of a face is best captured. How thickly paint should be applied. How free an artist should be to work in any way he wishes.
When he moved into a smaller house and his bankruptcy proceedings had been completed, all of the sales were done, you would think that Rembrandt had a fresh start. But he was not completely clear of potential creditors coming forth and making claims upon him. In order to protect himself from such potential claims, he entered into a scheme with Hendrikia and Titus. They created an art business and hired Rembrandt as their client, so that Rembrandt could say he didn't have assets, he was just drawing a salary.
What we see here on microfilm, because the original is heavily burned, is a contract. Contract dated December 15, 1660. And this is a contract between his son, Titus, and Hendrik Stoffels. You see obviously very clear Titus van Rijn, his signature. And here is Hendrik Stoffels, but she couldn't write. She made this cross here. Well, Rembrandt could. And he was the genius behind this. The third line is Rembrandt van Rijn, his own signature. Yeah, the only nasty thing is that I cannot directly receive money for my painting. But if Hendrikje and my son Titus will receive that money, then in the end, it comes into my pocket. And nobody knows. So this is a fraud, I think.
In essence, Rembrandt was using this business run by Hendrikia and Titus to launder the money that he had earned during this period of his bankruptcy and preserve it for himself.
One of the things that you can see with this business is that it also served as a surviving relative scheme. What Rembrandt does here is make sure that his lover, Hendrikje, and their daughter, Cornelia, will get money in case he might come to pass away. So what Rembrandt's actually doing is protecting his family.
He was not a criminal, maybe a little crook. Well, that's something we like. When people are doing things that are not allowed and they get away with it. Only not if you are the victim of this guy. Then you don't think it's funny.
I don't steal anybody's money. I just mean to stop other people taking mine. But the truth is, there's no one I trust more on earth than Hendrikia. 12 years we've been together, married or not. She protects me from the people that I paint for. If I can work in peace at all, it's thanks to her. I'm no longer fashionable, except with those who are no longer fashionable themselves. I find that the short queue of clients who ask me to take their likeness are mostly as old as myself, or older still. Standing on the edge of their eternal rest.
The portrait of Margarethe de Geer is for me one of my favorite paintings of women by Rembrandt. Rembrandt was an extremely empathetic portraitist of women, showing them with authority often, that they so often didn't have in other portraits. The portrait we have here is of a very significant woman who was the wife of Jacob Trip, of the famous Trip family of the Netherlands. They were a very wealthy couple, a very significant couple, and it's certainly very interesting to realize that even around 1661, when this was painted, he still could command that kind of patronage. Margarethe projects a real gravitas, but I don't think a sternness or harshness. She looks thoughtful, and she looks both at us and perhaps a little bit internally as well. Rembrandt really seems to have developed a specialty in painting age and the process of aging, studying what happens to faces, what happens to skin, how eyes get more watery, how hair gets wispier, and all these things he tracked and showed in his portraits.
As we age, we become poorer and poorer copies of our younger selves. Every old face carries the memory of something finer, firmer, more foolishly hopeful, mine included. So, when I'm commissioned to make a painting of the Apostle Paul, I sit for it myself. My face all hills and valleys, lines and blemishes. It's perfect.
He depicts himself as St. Paul, but on the other hand, it's Rembrandt himself. You see Rembrandt as he is. He really only focuses on what we need as the viewer to construct the image in our head. We see a turban, which is just a few brushstrokes, but we see a turban. His hair, which is fantastically painted with this dry brushwork. Only a few grey curls, but it's nearly as if you can touch it. In everything, he only touches it and it becomes the real thing. The rules of art were Italian beauty, classical beauty, and what does Rembrandt do? He's the rebel, he paints us as we are, with all our wrinkles, with his kind of saggy cheeks, and we see him, but at the same time we see ourselves.
Word goes around among us artists. The burgomasters want to decorate the town hall with paintings glorifying our Dutch history. Do they ask me? Of course not. They ask my pupil, Govert Flink, to make all 12 paintings. He paints as I used to, all fineness and finish, but with added flattery. He starts his sketches, but he dies. So the burgomasters have to ask other artists to complete this great cycle, and I'm one of them. Hardly any of these great men have spoken to me for years. It's a chance at last to reclaim my place as the greatest painter in the country. They give me the very first scene in the cycle, the moment when our ancestors, the Batavians, led by Claudius Civilis, take an oath to rise and revolt against their Roman overlords.
Rembrandt paints the leader, the main leader, sitting behind the table together with, well, all of the great other chiefs of the Batavians.
And the way he uses light as a main tool is absolutely incredible. It's if the tablecloth is illuminating in a way that's never been seen before.
But for some reason, and we do not completely know why, the burgomasters of Amsterdam didn't like the painting at all. So it must have been installed and hung there for just a few months. And then he had to take it down again. What we believe is that Rembrandt cut this 5.5 by 5.5 meters painting back to 2 by 3 meters, which is actually the painting that we are seeing right now in Stockholm.
They sent it back. They asked for changes. They forgot who they were asking.
We do not know what happened after the moment the painting was taken down. So there are, of course, several theories, and there is a chance that it was in his house up to the moment of his death.
I take a more practical view of this, because if I would get a painting this large back to my studio and I wouldn't be able to resell it anywhere, and it's a complete waste of space, I would take my Stanley knife out the same afternoon and and cut it down to size.
But it remains to me completely incomprehensible why they refused it. Because it is one, if you look at it now, it's one of the most amazing moments in the history of art.
When you look at the other paintings that are in the town hall still, that are so polite in a sort of grand style, that are kind of boring, this was just so out of whack with that almost the discordancy was too much for them to handle, perhaps, all across the board.
You're absolutely right. The other ones are institutionally dull. Mm-hmm. And here you have one of the most heroic moments of Dutch history is meant to be depicted, and you see quite a band.
A ragtag band that looks like a sort of a Last Supper gone awry, where you have 11 figures, and here they are, like a bunch of drunken louts. Only Civilis looks really dead serious, you could say. Well, maybe a few others too. They're a ragtag bunch. There's a laughing, smiling, drunken figure at right. People are leaning over. Hardly anybody stands up straight as they swear this oath.
The burgomasters wanted a painting to enlarge our history, to make our Dutch Republic seem grand and noble. But it isn't. The leading men of the Batavians were as human as our burgomasters are today. Vain, venal, crazy, drunk. I gave them the Claudius that the Roman histories described, a man with one ruined eye. He stares us down. I surrounded him with drunks and priests. I gave them something I could actually imagine happening. Naturally, they gave it back, having no imagination themselves.
Rembrandt is totally obsessed with his own search, his own idea of what art should be. And I think he was convinced that others would understand or should understand.
I think Rembrandt never bothers. I mean, he creates what he thinks is the only right thing to do. He simply does not relate, I believe, to what the commissioner thinks to be the right solution.
Yeah, I think he clearly didn't take that really into account. And I think we've discussed a lot of things about, the decorum in this picture. I mean, obviously, he wasn't really concerned about whether he thought it was decorous or not.
He may have given it a thought, but in the end, I don't think he really cared. We know from so much of his work that when the choice was between money and prestige, especially later in life, and making a painting that really would make a contribution to art, to the art of painting, he chose the latter.
I think the exciting thing is with Rembrandt, with every painting, he takes a step into the unknown. So he cannot think about his client. Good art is never painted to satisfy the client, and Rembrandt is a great artist.
Rembrandt's legacy is, of course, his art. During these periods of financial distress and personal turmoil, his art hardly suffered. In fact, most would say it flourished because through all the turmoil, Rembrandt maintained his supreme autonomy over his work. There was a common question asked to painters in the 17th century that still gets asked of painters today. How do you know when a painting is finished? Rembrandt's answer to that question was, a painting is finished when the master has realized his intention in it. This anecdote is an extraordinary declaration by Rembrandt of the power that an artist has over his product.
To be misunderstood by pompous fools, well, it's a sort of badge of honour. But there was another commission that year that went much better. More men at table, but this time a group portrait for the leading members of the Drapers' Guild. I painted them as though I'd interrupted their meeting, and now they all stare out at you. What are you doing here?
Well, this painting, I mean, the Syndics, was made exactly at the same moment as Rembrandt painted his Claudius Civilis. But it's completely different. I mean, if we would not know the dates, if the paintings would not have been dated, we could have believed that they were made in completely different time periods in his later stage of his life. I think when we talk about Rembrandt's late style, it's about different aspects. It's about his way of portraying really human beings of flesh and blood. I mean, you can almost hear blood running through their veins. And he doesn't idealize. So I mean, there's a very short distance between us as beholders and the people that have been portrayed. The way he involves us in the story, so he makes us part of what he wants to tell. I mean, they look at us as if they are disturbed by us just entering the room. It's quite tempting to think that we are not really welcome in this area.
I make them into actors in this little drama. I play with where they're placed until it all seems right to me. I paint out, I repaint. I move people around in the picture until they say, "Leave me here."
The X-ray would have been made many decades ago. The next image, it's not a full image. Essentially, the majority of the painting was scanned. And then this gave much more detailed information about what was really going on with those changes. And so for the first time, you could see that there was an earlier position here of the servant in the background. He seems to have been here at the lower right. So it sort of seems that he was positioned some 3-4 times before he actually had his final position here in the background. I think this is probably the kind of change you see invariably in these more complex compositions. I think he was constantly sort of changing and experimenting. How else could one explain the kind of things that you sort of encounter in these paintings?
Of course, there's no extra money for the struggle, but I can't be satisfied with a picture that any of my competitors could paint. This year's been hard. My little family mustn't starve. So I sell my Saskia's grave in the Ouderkerk. She's been dead for 20 years. There's plague in Amsterdam. The city reeks.
So, this is a burial book from the Westerkerk, and there is registered here on the 24th of July 1663 is the burial of Hendrikje Stoffels. And they had to pay 10 guilders and 13 pennies for this burial. Not much. This was the average sum for an adult. Nothing special. Yeah, so this is the registration of the death of Hendrikje in 1663.
The plague took her from me. I hid behind her. She spoke for me. What have I lost? Everything. Nothing. The world. My wife in all but name, a mother for Titus and Cornelia. 10 guilders for a rented grave. Henrikia.
He has lost the second great love of his life, Hendrik Stoffels. And so inevitably you would have to think that he is thinking back on this period of adversity. The fact that despite all that, he sticks to what he loves best perhaps in the world, which is to paint and to make innovative painting, is to me an incredible and astonishing accomplishment, not just of painting, but of will. Rembrandt has created probably the best portrait of himself that he made in a long career of making self-portraits. Let's take the most extraordinary aspect of this passage of the hand, where you see him holding, with kind of a rough outline of a thumb, first of all a palette, a bunch of brushes like a spray, and this long stick with a knob at the end, which is called a mole stick, something that painters use to steady their hand when painting. And this hand almost disappears. Indeed, there's almost a little violence in how he does this painting. When people say that Rembrandt is really a modern painter, this is the sort of thing they think about, where this indeed becomes an almost abstract set of forms.
It's almost all that's left of me, the painter. But I paint him as I paint now, a true face in a picture that fades towards the edges, melts beyond the frame. In my life, stupid ironies abound. Almost 10 years after my insolvency, the country's highest court decides that Titus's right to his inheritance from his mother precedes all the other debts that I incurred thereafter. They force my one-time creditors to repay the money and give it to Titus instead, over 10,000 guilders. The old debt that prevented me from marriage is discharged. So I can marry now. Now that my Henrika's dead. And now, of course, 2 newlyweds commission me to paint their portraits, but as historical figures, as Isaac and Rebekah from the book of Genesis. They travel in a strange land, and for safety pretend to be brother and sister, rather than husband and wife. In a secret moment, they embrace.
This painting is not just a portrait, and in this case a very exceptional portrait, but it's also about the pleasure of painting. This is in the latest decade of his life, and you see how he really dares to play around with different textures, for example, and techniques. Even using palette knives here and there as well, scratching into the wet paint, but also almost, sculpting in paint over here. I think one of the greatest, let's say 10 square centimeters in art history is this particular part. It's abstract art. It's Mark Rothko, 1665. Rembrandt is always relevant, and Rembrandt is always contemporary, even 350 years after he made this in his workshop in Amsterdam.
When Vincent van Gogh saw this painting for the first time, he was totally blown away by the painting, and he wrote to his brother Theo that this was the most intimate painting that he had ever seen, the most sympathetic painting he had ever seen. It's all about touch. Yeah, I think Maybe I'm exaggerating, but I think that Rembrandt invented intimacy. He looked and searched for the most natural gestures to express certain emotions. In this painting, for example, it's how he's placed Isaac's hand on Rebecca's bosom, and then she's gently stroking that hand. And then there are the two other hands that frame these two central hands, as it were. That's simply marvelous. But in a certain sense, I think this is also a portrayal of Rembrandt's profound love for Hendrikje.
I remember what it was like to be a lover. And Isaac was much older than Rebecca, too, as I was older than Hendrikje. And so this picture has a ghost in it. Or two. Yes, two. God wants me to be solitary.
And now it's the final registration on Titus. Titus van Rijn, the son of Rembrandt, it's written here. And he was buried on a Friday, on the 7th of September in 1668. So 5 years after Hendrikje Stoffels, Rembrandt's son, Titus, he died as a young guy.
My boy was only 26. He leaves his pregnant wife behind. And me, of course.
We see that in 1669 there was a baptism of Titia, the daughter of Titus van Rijn and Magdalena van Loo. And who was the godfather of this child? Rembrandt van Rijn himself. So in 1669, Rembrandt is the godfather of his grandchild, Titia van Rijn. And yeah, maybe he's holding the child.
This is the moment in 1669 when he paints Simeon in the temple carrying the little Jesus. And we know that, according to the Gospel of Luke, Simeon was promised not to die before he saw the Savior. And this is that moment. And we see Simeon, closed eyes, with the little baby and his hands in prayer. It's quite striking to see that Simeon was allowed to die at this particular moment, but so was Rembrandt. This was the painting that was still on Rembrandt's easel when he died, 62 years old.
A final document, also 1669. A few months after he was the godfather of his granddaughter, we see the end of Rembrandt. Rembrandt van Rijn was buried in the Westerkerk for 15 guilders. It's obvious from what we know now that this was not his own grave, which would have been also unlogical, seeing his financial situation. So these people, they were in rented graves, and after a while they needed some more space in the church. They removed these old graves and the old remains were put together and disposed.
Usually the story of Rembrandt ends as all romantic artist stories should end. The artist alone and unknown and unloved. I remembered his daughter being still alive. I thought it'd be nice if she took care of him. She visits him, and while he's working, of course, on another self-portrait. And at the end, as Cornelia leaves, she gives him a little kiss, and he is there all alone in his studio. Finally, that moment has come, and he looks through the window. He sees her leave and disappear in the snow. In the end, there's Rembrandt in his room with all his things and a self-portrait on his easel. He looks to the ceiling, he looks outside, he looks at the moon and the passing clouds. And as it gets really dark, and you see his fading self-portrait, and it all ends in darkness.
There's an incredible economy in the way he's painted this. He does away with his sketch layer in the painting. He just paints directly on top of a brown ground in an incredibly quick, experimental fashion. I think it was painted quite quickly, even though there are changes that have happened in the hat. You know, initially we see in the X-ray there was a white painter's cap, but there are other parts that were obviously painted just in very quickly, probably a matter of hours. The face, of course, is brilliant. And of course the flesh paint is fabulous, the way it's just manipulated and to create this sort of texture of the aging skin. I see somebody who is still fully in command of his skills and still experimenting and still a searching artist. That's what I see in the painting.
It's a picture full of the artist and of his life and of his achievements and his failures and of his art. Of course, he would not have known that this was his last self-portrait. But perhaps he had a faint feeling it might have been his last.
How do you know when something is finished? Well, creeps up on you. You think there's hours of work to do, and then the brush lifts from the last stroke, and you take 2 paces back, and there. It's finished. Your whole life